Hello and welcome to another developer diary. So there have been a lot of changes since the last one, and they're mostly focused on the visual side of things. So there's not really going to be any code that I'll be sharing this time. There'll be a few bits of code that I might take a look at, but there's not going to be any large chunks that I'm sharing because most of the changes this time have been visual side things. So let's take a look. So one of the big things, and I mentioned this last time that I was looking at doing this, was a switch-in render pipeline. So with the testing, I was finding that in Universal, especially after the optimizations, I was getting really, really good performance. In non-release, non-debug builds was getting sort of 200 to 300 frames per second. So I have actually switched over to the high definition pipeline. And this was something where I wanted to test with that. You can see I've integrated in a time of day system as well. And one of the other big things that I've added in, which we'll see once the train starts moving, is start moving. There are now visual effects in there that tie into the speed of the train. And if I bring in some more carriages, so we'll bring in, and these are still ones where they are untextured, which is intentional. But, so we've got, this is the untextured version for what will be the main engine carriage, which will have a forward-facing camera. That may be something that I do end up needing to sacrifice potentially, I'm going to see, just because it is something that is a bit of a hit. Performance-wise. We've got carriage here that's going to be a whole bunch of battery storage. These are the top tier versions of the carriages as well. So these are not the base initial versions. So we've got a few different ones, and the way that it now works is when it goes to spawn a carriage, it picks a particular type. So based upon the type, it'll spawn in different carriages, and that's how it sort of, currently at the moment, it just randomly picks between ones. What carriage gets imported, or how it looks, is tied to the particular upgrades. So at the moment, I've got a heap of the upgrades installed. So as a result, we get all of the stuff spawning in for the carriages, which is looking quite cool. So things like the railings and everything like of that won't be there in the actual base versions of the carriages. And if I actually turn off all of the upgrades, then when we run this, we'll have much more basic versions of the carriages. And also we have less powerful versions of the engines that are going to be present. So we've got more basic versions where they're just a single story. So these will be the base early versions of it, will just be these much more simplified looking ones. So I've only done a little bit of tweaking with the HDRP, with the setup. I've added in some bloom, a little bit in terms of other tweaks and that. The bloom in particular comes out really nice with these rocket engines, and the rocket engines in particular, if I switch so I can actually capture the stuff, it's always the fun of trying to capture stuff without it moving. If I lower the speed, we'll see that lowers those effects and ramps up. So those are using visual effects graph. And those are actually a really good thing to take a look at in terms of how they're set up, because in terms of what the code passes through to them, there's actually very little. It passes through this speed factor, which that speed factor is that same 0 to 1 slider that gets used. And it can also then pass through whether it is a big engine or a little engine. So there's two different sizes for the engine. What then happens, how that actually gets used, is all done within the visual effect itself. And that was a very intentional thing, that I didn't want to have a lot of the stuff didn't want to have to manually set up a lot of the things. I wanted to keep it very simple. So if we take a look at the visual effect of what I'm doing with that, we'll zoom in a bit. So it does have multiple tuning settings. Most of these I don't end up needing to mess with. And from a runtime point of view, the only thing that I'm continually updating is speed. And even then, only when the speed changes. So that is able to boost the spawn rate and the lifetime. So that's something where it can change that. And what will also happen then, so that's spawning based on distance. So to get it spawning based on distance, it's grabbing, what it does is it takes a location, in this case 000, transforms that to world space. I've also set up the system so that the reference simulation space is world space. Because of the length of the particle system and because it can vary based upon the speed that we're going at, the bounds setting mode I changed to automatic, and you'll see the capacity is currently quite large. I'm probably going to be able to reduce that, but it's currently set to be fairly large. And it's just emitting them from a circle. One of the things I'm thinking of potentially changing there is changing that to emitting in a sphere, because then the core of it should be denser than the exterior, just based upon it's got a larger area to be spawning in there. So that's something I'm considering doing. There's a little bit of noise added in, not a huge amount, because I don't want the things going too wild. I just want a little bit of noise there. And it's just outputting cubes, where again, the size, the big rocket is able to emit larger cubes, so it takes up a larger area. With the output, these, as I said, the simulation space is set to auto, and the color, by having the blend mode set to additive, that then means this color, which starts at a sort of deepish red, through to an orange, through to a dark gray, then through to finally white. That's how it's getting that nice sort of progression. And using additive means that it really sort of stands out and you're getting a lot of brightness from it, which looks really cool, and I'm really happy with how that's set up. The logic with the carriages, for choosing how to spawn them, has actually been one of the more involved areas. Because if we take a look at the actual structure for a carriage, there's quite a lot to it. So this is the actual carriage prefab. And how I have decided to set it up is I have meshes, collision, and UI. And then on the carriage, you can see I have this component map, which the component map, particular components have behaviors assigned to them. So behavior is going to control for the type of car that's spawning. So every type of car has a lower floor. But then things like the stairs aren't supported for the engine carriages. So the supported behaviors only list the particular ones. So what this is allowing me to do is then when it spawns a particular entry, it goes through and it checks, does it, is the type of carriage being spawned in the supported behaviors? If it is, then it might be able to show the object. Then it also checks against these visibility rules, which those visibility rules can check, okay, does there have to be a particular upgrade present? Or does that particular upgrade have to be absent? That way it can make sure that stuff is only there in certain cases. Because things like these lightning rods should only be there if, the upper ones should only be there for if we've got the upper deck, the lower ones should only be there for the lower deck. So this is a lot. I do have a rebuild carriage data button that auto-populates these because it looks for the names matching. But then there is a lot of extra setup within this. So if I do need to rebuild this, there is going to be a little bit of further infrastructure I'll need there just to make sure I'm not having to manually reset up all of this. As you can see, there is currently 28 items there, which is quite a lot. And for some of them, most of them, the rules are fairly simple. Some of them, it does get a little bit complex. With all of these, They do have separate collisions, so I'm not using mesh colliders for anything where I can avoid it. The one exception is for the train. And in this case for the actual engine. So we can see for the engine itself, that does use a mesh collider. And the reason for that is because I know when I'm playing a game, I always want to try and be able to get to anywhere I possibly could on it. And that's something where, in this case, people are going to want to stand at the front of the engine. I want to stand at the front of the engine because it looks cool. So why wouldn't I want to do that? So what I've done is this is fairly basic, but what I did was I drew out and squished a sphere using ProBuilder and then cut off sections of it. And then that links over to a pipe for the main section. So the engine carriage was one of the most complicated ones, just from a building point of view and also from a collision setup point of view. And there is currently quite a lot of space in the engine carriage. That's likely going to change. I will, in the engine carriage, end up putting in stuff like I do want to have things there, or if we get this running, we'll be able to see it a bit easier. I do want to have things in there like being able to see some storage batteries, being able to see a little bit of storage stuff in that, and space probably for a teleporter at this stage. So there's a bunch of things I do want to make sure I've got space for in here. There will be upgrade screens as well. So at the front here, there's going to be different screens to interact with stuff. Those upgrade screens, those will be present in any of the particular ones. So that is something where any of the carriages will have an upgrade screen. So if I add in a new carriage, then inside that carriage, in this center area, is where there'll be the bits of UI. So I want to have that camera display, if it ends up being viable performance-wise. Really do want to be able to have that if I can at all possible costs, because I think that looks really cool. I want to have some stats there in terms of just being able to see things like time of day, being able to see energy and other stats there I think would be really useful to be able to see. And just being able to get a few of those things going will be really cool. So those will be sort of some of the next stuff I'll be working on. You'll notice that the time of day is changing. It's actually it's looking quite a bit more involved than just the direction changing. And there's actually very little that I'm doing with that. I am using my time of day system, which for the light, there's very little that it needs to do. The reason being that most of this is handled by, I am using, and this is one of the advantages of stuff we get with HDRP, the physically based sky. So this is going to be linking to this directional light, because this light is set to be affecting the physically based sky. So that means we're able to be having this work really nicely, where just by changing the rotation of the light here, and you can see just if I change it in the inspector, we actually get pretty decent looking lighting happening quite effectively, and we get full time of day changes, and we'll get the sunrise happening. So I'll be able to set up something like probably a moon and things like that as well. So being able to get those up and running will be really cool, but it's getting a really nice visual effect at the moment. So the HDRP switch seems to be working out pretty nicely. In terms of sort of the next bits of focus for stuff, then some of the things I want to be getting up and running once we start moving. So I do want to have this where I've got the objects being spawned in the environment. So that's going to be a big part of some of the next stuff to add in, is spawning those objects. So I want to get fairly quickly to the point where I've got a representative level of complexity in the environment. because that's going to be really important to make sure that this is going to be viable performance-wise, because that is a big risk with, there's going to be multiple engine cars, and so having a lot of different things in there is a potential performance issue. It doesn't really get affected too much at the moment by adding in additional carriages, so it does manage to hold up pretty well. And there's a lot of common elements to the meshes. They don't actually have a huge amount of data in them, so they're not ridiculous in terms of with the meshes. At the moment, one of the things that is impacting probably in the biggest way is actually that render to texture. That does chop in pretty significantly. If I keep spawning carriages, we can comfortably get up to 20. We're still pretty reliably hitting over 100. And this is in the editor, so in a build is going to tend to be faster again. But that is something where it is going to be pretty crucial to ensure that it can get the performance. So once I add in those additional objects in the environment, that's going to be a factor. But the batches, stuff like of that, are pretty efficient at the moment. So performance-wise, pretty happy with it. Certainly the switch to HDRP has worked out really well in terms of how that's actually going. So yes, the next focus is going to be getting the objects into the environment. And once those objects are in the environment, then seeing where things are at performance-wise, starting to ramp up the post-processing. So even before I start getting more of the actual game logic in, I want to just really push things on that performance side, just to be confident that the performance is going to hit where I need it to hit. And that's why I got the time of day system in, because one of the things was concerned about was, okay, the lighting being static could mean that it can be caching the stuff, which could mean I'm not seeing the full impact of performance. So then as soon as I have the shadows moving, that could then have a real impact. So that's why I've gone and hooked up the time of day and why I'm doing all of the testing while it's actually moving. So that makes that a little bit more reassuring in terms of knowing where the performance is at. So yes, next focus is going to be getting all of the bits of objects spawning in the environment. So there's a lot of different objects I need to make, because I need small, medium, and large sized objects. And I want to have at least, I'd say like 3 to 5 different ones of each type of one, and being able to spawn lots of them in the environment. So that's going to be something where that's going to push up the performance a bunch, but I have a feeling that it's still going to be okay performance-wise, because there isn't a huge amount that I've done yet already on optimization. So there's still a lot of room for further optimization there. But the next video, you see, there will be a lot of objects spawning in the environment, likely some more tweaks to post-processing, and I think I'm going to be aiming for having the first-pass versions of some of the UI, like the status UI, in there will be a big thing, and getting the engine booster carriages in there, because I've already got a lot of particles, but would be kind of nice to have even more particles in there, and see where that is going in terms of getting that up and running. Thanks, folks. I hope you found the video interesting. There are going to be more developer diaries along the way as I keep working on the game. In terms of when I think the game's going to be done, it still feels like at this stage, at least I would say 4 weeks. I feel like it's probably going to be more like around 6 to 8 weeks. It's going to really depend upon if I run into any major roadblocks when I start having a lot more objects spawning in the environment and getting that game logic set up. It's also the balancing side of it I know is going to take a chunk of time, because there's quite a lot of pieces that I do need to balance for it. But I think 6 to 8 weeks is sort of my gut feel from this point of when I think it's going to be done. But it's progressing really nicely. Performance is going well with it. So I'm looking forward to sharing more of the bits that I'm adding to it going forward. And next time, depending on the changes, there'll likely be some more code with that. This time around there wasn't really anything that was useful from a code point of view, but next time there might be some cool things that I can be sharing hopefully from the code side as well. And until next time, bye.